I guess it is time to start with things. Anybody have any questions from what we looked at last week?
I have one.
Okay.
You mentioned, was it divination?
Divination.
Divination, okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It is a mystical black magic thing where whatever he did with the cup, he was trying to foretell the future or see what was going on. And so that's why I said I don't think that Joseph was really doing it, but the Egyptians did. And so since he's being an Egyptian, that would not have been too surprising that, he would have said, you took the cup that I use for divination. Don't you know that I can figure things out because, I've got a cup that you stole. So, but I don't know, that just doesn't seem to be within Joseph's character to do that, But it does seem to be within the ruse that he was trying to pull on his brothers. Okay, good question. By the way, anybody else have anything? Okay. Well, if you remember last week, we looked at how God used Joseph to get Israel down into Egypt. And so that kind of finished up that little section of our study on the Exodus. Because now we see that Israel is down into Egypt. And so now we're going to kind of see how the events are going to lay themselves out for God's judgment that's going to be coming on Egypt. And so tonight we're going to be looking at a change of circumstances that has taken place. Now, when the Israelites went down into Egypt, and on the map, Goshen is like right here. It wasn't, that's not even very... You can't really see that very well either. Goshen is kind of like right here, okay? That was the perfect place for them. And if you think about it, they had a pretty good setup, right? I mean, they were in a fertile spot. They had everything taken care of for them. They were in a fantastic country. I mean, just everything was going very well with them. However, if you recall, what did God tell Abraham back in Genesis chapter, I think it was 15, that we looked at? That his descendants were going to be in foreign land for 430 years, and then
he would be taking them back to their property of all the people around them.
Yeah. Back here, and God was going to use them to judge the Canaanites in that area, okay? So the question is, now that God has gotten them here, and here is a good place, because here is going to be a place for them to develop and grow as far as from just a small family into a nation, all right? And so, here they are in Egypt. They've grown into a nation. But God doesn't want them in Egypt. God wants them here. So how does God get them there, especially if this is a good place? I mean, hey, they're like just about everybody else. When you got it good, why change, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you like where you're at, just stay there. Okay, what would make them get from Egypt over into Canaan? God, right? Just as God used circumstances and unpleasant events in order to get Israel down to Egypt, now the same is going to be true to get them out of Egypt as well, and especially for the plans and purposes that God has in what he's going to do to judge Egypt. Okay? All right. So what we're looking at is that when we go from the book of Genesis into the book of Exodus into the first chapter, all of a sudden now we see this change of circumstance that takes place. And like I said, the circumstances, the times, they needed to change. Nothing would have ever gotten done if they hadn't changed. Okay? So what we see, starting in verse number 6, is this. It says, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to the people, 'the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country.'" Okay, so maybe what we need to do is we need to talk about the timing of the Exodus. Okay, so as far as the time of the Exodus, nobody really knows when it happened, but there's two generally recognized dates that it could have taken place. One is going to be in 1446 BC, and the other generally recognized date is going to be 1225 BC. Okay? Now, like I said, nobody knows for sure, but if somebody's going to be looking at, dates, you're either going to come across one or the other more than likely, because these are kind of the two most popular dates. Now, some people say this is the conservative date. Some people say this is the more liberal date. And, I'll get into that. This right here has more scriptural reasons in Scripture for picking this. This is more based on archaeology than it is scriptural evidence. But that's not to say that there isn't any scriptural evidence for this at all. And that's not to say that there isn't any archaeological evidence for this one at all. It's just that this one has, the earlier date has more scriptural evidence. This one has more archaeological evidence to it, if that makes any sense. I kind of like this earlier date over the latter date for that reason. Okay, but at the same time, if I get to heaven and Moses says, "No, you were way off," I'm going to say, "Okay, well, you know, I don't know," even though he doesn't know the 1476 BC dates, because they didn't count back then. How can you count for something from something in the future? Doesn't really make sense. Okay, but I digress. So if 1476 BC was the date that the Israelites left Egypt, then what date did they go down into Egypt? Okay. You remember what God told Abraham. God said that your descendants are going to be how long?
430 years.
Okay, so 1446 plus 130, because since we're going back, we've got to add time. We go, back in time, we've got to add time. So that leaves us with 1886 BC. And so on our timeline here, we can see that if the Israelites came out in 1446, that means that in 1886, right? Is my math right there? 76, yeah. Yeah, 76. I had it right over there. 1876 is when they went into Egypt. And so that's going to put Joseph just, maybe about, say, 12 years, 13 years before that, as far as when he first went into Egypt. Okay? Now, at the same time, 1225 plus 430 equals 1655. Okay? And so we will squeeze 1655 right there. And so If this date is true, then that's when they went into Egyptian bondage. If this date is true, then that's the date that they went in. Okay? All right. Now, the reason why I want to bring these up is because, and by no means am I an Egyptologist. I don't know very much about Egypt history. As a matter of fact, what you see right here is pretty much it. So, but this is some information that I got off Wikipedia. So, got to be right. But anyway, here's kind of a little chart about the Egyptian dynasties about this time period. And if you notice that in almost 2000 BC, they were at the 12th dynasty. That means that Egypt is very old. And it also means that things changed hands a whole bunch. You might be wondering, well, what in the world is a dynasty? I guess the dynasty is, you got a line of kings that succeeded, and that's a dynasty. And then all of a sudden, somebody else comes in and takes over, and then that starts another dynasty. Okay? And so as far as these dynasties are concerned, if you look at these dates, the 1446, 1446 is going to fall in line with the 18th dynasty right here as far as the possible date of the Exodus. And that would mean that 1876 would be right in here in the 12th dynasty as far as when they went in. Okay? All right, the same if you take 1225. 1225 is going to be right here in the 19th dynasty for the Exodus. And then, what was it, 1655? 1655 is going to be right in here when they went in, okay, in the 13th dynasty. Now, the reason why I want to bring all of this up is because right here in between the 12th, let me switch colors here. In between the 12th and the 13th dynasties, there was like a big changeover that took place. And then in between the 18th and 19th century or dynasties, there was another big change that went over. This, as far as according to Egyptian history, which I know very little about, is going to be the Middle Kingdom. This is going to be the New Kingdom. And this in here is going to be just kind of an intermediate time. And the reason why this is going to be an intermediate time is because along in this area, there were, it was a new kind of Pharaoh that was involved from some people called the Hyksos people. And you say, okay, who were the Hyksos people? According to historians, the Hyksos people were not Egyptians at all. When you had dynasties that took over, they were Egyptians, except for the Hyksos. The Hyksos were actually foreign people. The Hyksos actually came from what people think up here in this area. This is going to be north of Israel. And so they came down into Egypt, and ancient historical records say that there was a big battle, there was a big war, and they defeated the Egyptians and they took over. More modern history and archaeology says, well, it really wasn't that big of a battle. They just came in and moved in and kind of took over and assimilated and then rose to power. Okay? But whatever the case is, you can kind of look at this chart right here, and you can kind of see maybe just a little bit, no matter what dates you go with, about here when we take a look at verse number 9, verse number 8, where it says, then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power. You see, if Joseph went in here, right, in the 12th dynasty, then you can kind of see that maybe some people knew about Joseph and knew about what Joseph did and were sympathetic to the Jews. But then all of a sudden, when the Hyksos comes in, they don't know any of that. And they don't care about any of that. Instead, they are, they're just kind of concerned about their own power, right? And so when all of the events of the Exodus are happening, even though that's going to be happening down in this area, either the Hyksos have already been defeated and other people are coming in, and then they're concerned about things, or it's remnants of that kingdom holding on. Again, don't know very much about Egyptian history, and at the same time, we're just talking about things that could be. What I'm doing is saying, okay, here's possible dates. Let's look at possible history and see how things line up, right? Because when you take a look at what the situation, the circumstances are, when this new king comes to power, verse number 9, he says, "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us." One thing about the Hyksos is that they really didn't have a whole lot of people. They were very few in number. It's just that they had all the power. They had a consolidation of power. But as far as the actual numbers go, they didn't really have it. And so if you really don't have a whole lot of people, then what are you going to be looking at? Well, those people over there outnumber us, right? We are now concerned about those people over there who are very numerous. They may not pose any threat to us, but what if? So you can see they're concerned about that. Okay? Now, at the same time, if Joseph is coming in here, then you can see that maybe, new Pharaoh on the throne, even though I think that this was an Egyptian, and the Hyksos really didn't start until after that. You can kind of see that maybe after going through all the Hyksos, then this new kingdom that's in here, now, the Egyptians lost the throne, had foreign invaders come in, take the throne. They've taken the throne back. Now it's kind of like, hey, look, we've got more foreigners over there. Okay? So what I'm saying is that, either way you go, you can kind of see a little bit of a factor into that, can't you? Yeah? Okay. So what did they do? Well, they turned to oppressing Israel. In verse number 11, it says, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses." By the way, did I mention last week I said that Joseph built store cities? I was wrong about that. I mean, it doesn't say that in Genesis. I think I was thinking of this. And so, he gathered up the grain and everything and stored it away. But it doesn't say anything about store cities. When I looked at that, I thought, that's what I was thinking of. And I went back and looked at it, and it's not there. So anyway, but with the forced labor, they went and built Pithom and Ramses store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so, the Egyptians were kind of like, hey, if we just make people so tired, then they're going to be, too tired to go and have babies. And so, but that didn't work. They just kept on growing. It says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. Okay? But it didn't work. So, we're going to stick with plan A, but we're also now going to add plan B. What's plan B? Plan B is this. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live." Talk about brutality. Okay? And, Now, the Israelites at this point are hundreds of thousands, and so there's 2 midwives. How can 2 midwives be taking care of all the women? I don't know. I don't know if, maybe this was, 2 midwives that were, kind of like the leading charge of them, or, a representative of midwives, or, 2 midwives that didn't do what the Lord, what he wanted. I don't know. But looking at these 2 women, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. They didn't kill the babies. They were pretty good midwives, weren't they? We're going to let the babies live and not commit, capital murder. So I guess that's a pretty good thing, isn't it? And so in verse number 18, the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" And the midwives' answer was, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before we get there." So, by the time that we get there, it's all said and done. And so there's nothing that we can do. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born to you, you must throw in the Nile, but every girl, let every girl live." Okay. And so if it's a baby boy, goes into the river. If it's a baby girl, you can let her live. Just think about that. I mean, think about the trauma of that. You have a baby and you're just thinking, I hope it's not a boy, I hope it's not a boy, I hope it's not a boy. And then if it's a boy, then all of a sudden you've got a hard choice to make. Do you comply with the king's request, or do you disobey it and put maybe your own life and your baby's life in jeopardy? I mean, this is bitter oppression, isn't it? I mean, it's bitter oppression that you're involved with this slave labor. And by the way, the slave labor is not like you are removed from your family and you're put into this labor camp and that's everything like that. It would be that you would have your family, you would have your land, you'd have your flocks, everything like that, but you would be required to go and do this work and then go back and do your own work. And so you talk about the stress and the bitterness that's involved with that. You talk about the bitterness of knowing that people are against you, the bitterness that here you have the command that you're supposed to throw the babies into the Nile River. I mean, this is a bad situation, isn't it? If we think that we have it bad here today, we don't have it bad here today. Okay? All right. So from all of this, now we see that God is going to raise up a deliverer. Moses, chapter 2, says, "Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and when she became pregnant, she gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch, then placed the child in it and put him among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him." Let's see, how old is little Munchkin now?
3 months.
How much?
3.
3 months. Okay. She's probably going to start to get a little noisy.
Sir?
Okay. Moses probably was a good child. He's a fine child, is what it says there. But when he was quiet, it was really easy to keep him hidden away, right? But as he starts to get a little bit older and he starts to get a little bit more noisy, what is she going to do? She can't hide him any longer. And so the plan was, make a basket for him and then coat it, make it waterproof, and then put him out there and then have his sister watch over him. Now, I don't think that she was abandoning him by any means, but that would have been a hiding place, and then she could have gone and taken care of him and everything like that. Okay? All right. So what we see in verse number 5 is, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister, who was there, watching after things, she's seen slave girl go over there. Oh, she found the basket. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Oh, there's Pharaoh's daughter. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Oh, they're talking. They're saying, sympathetic because Moses is crying. Man, she's got a good head on her shoulders. What she does is she just goes and says, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go. Okay. Takes off and she gets mom. Okay. This is Miriam. Miriam's got a good head on her shoulders for a girl, young girl, doesn't she? I think so. That's some smart thinking right there. Okay. So she went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him up out of the water. So imagine that. Imagine the Lord's blessing right there. Not only did Moses' mother get to keep Moses, and at least till he was weaned, that could have been, 2, 3, 4 years old even. All right. But at the same time, she was getting paid for it too. What a deal. You get paid to babysit your own kid. How about that? Okay. So then after all that, we see that Moses was taken over to Pharaoh's daughter, lived there in the palace. Okay. Now, let's skip over to Acts chapter 7. All right. In Acts chapter 7, the context of this is that Stephen, one of the first deacons, was preaching, and he was hauled in before the Sanhedrin, and he was they're about to stone him, is what they were about to do. And he gives this defense. And in giving his defense, he goes on this very long history lesson. And I think that the Spirit was inspiring him to give this history because some of the things that we see here are very insightful to details about really all Old Testament history. But as he goes on down, talks about, starting with Abraham and going to talk about Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, they get to Moses. And what we see, starting in chapter 7 and verse number 20, it says, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Now, we read over in Exodus, and there's a little bit more to it, right? It's not just 3 months, then taken to Pharaoh's daughter. It was 3 months hidden, then in the reeds, and then, mother takes care of him after weaning, then goes over there. Okay? But I want you to look at verse number 22. Okay? It says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was powerful in speech and action. Okay? So I think that oftentimes we think of Moses, and what we're going to look at next week when we see in chapter 3 is that he's saying, I'm a man of faltering tongue. He was a man who lacks some self-confidence. Moses wasn't this way at this point in time. The reason is he has been brought up in Pharaoh's household. He could have very well been some sort of military commander, had some sort of very big position. He would have been about 40 years old at the time, and so, we don't need to look at him as some sort of teenager. We need to look at him as far as somebody who has been brought up and, cultivated to have very important positions in Egypt. And so he is educated in all the wisdom. The Egyptian was powerful in speech and action. Okay? Now, thinking with that in mind, let's go back and let's look at the next story in Moses' life. All right? See if it plays any role in what we're about to talk about. Okay, so in verse number 11, it says, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were watching and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' The man said, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Why are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?'" Okay? Now, if we think of Moses as being, as we see him in chapter 3, somebody who is insecure about things, somebody who's not a man mighty in deed and action, we may be thinking that Moses just went out to see what was going on, observed it, and just thought, "Oh, you know what? I got to do something. Well, nobody's around. I'm just going to go and I'm going to intervene," and he kills the Egyptian, right? And then he just happens to see a couple of people fighting the next day and said, "Hey, you guys stop that. Oh, who are you to make a ruler or a judge over us?" And then he gets scared because now somebody's found out what he did, and so he's going to run off. Okay? But if you factor in how he is mighty in speech and in action, there's more to the story than that. Let's go back to the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 7 and in verse number 23, it says, "When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not." Okay, so what was Moses' purpose of killing the Egyptian?
To protect his Hebrew family.
Protect his Hebrew family, but do you think that maybe there's a little bit more?
He's resentful that he's being raised in the Egyptian home.
I would have rather been raised in an Egyptian home than in a Hebrew home if it was just, that's all that there was to it. Okay? But what did you think about that last little sentence there, that he realized, or he was thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not? Do you think that maybe Moses was wanting to start a revolt? Do you think if he went and if he killed an Egyptian, that other people would say, "You know what? We can take these guys. We can overthrow them." Now, what is going on here? Does God want the Israelites out? Yeah, he does. Does God want Moses to do it? Yes, he does. Is Moses realizing it? Yes, he is. But here's the thing. It's got to be in God's hands. It's got to be according to God's plans, and it's got to be according to God's timing. So many times I think that we go and we try to do things according to ourselves, even though it's a good thing and even though it may be something that God wants. But when we start to put ourselves involved in it, then all of a sudden we're not doing what God wants. We're really kind of getting in God's way. So was Moses at this point in time. And so when he came up to the two Hebrews and fought together, you notice that the next day, this is in verse number 26, the next day Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian as yesterday?" In other words, Moses' plan had fallen flat. And so that's the reason why when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Now, going back to Exodus chapter 2, what we see is this. Moses chapter 2, it says, verse number 14, the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And so here's Moses, and Moses boogies up out of town, okay? Goes to Midian, and when you go back and you look at the map here, Midian is going to be, off the map, down in this area down here. And so here he is in Egypt, and, well, excuse me about that. Midian is probably in this area right here. And so he's going to go down here. In fact, he's going to go and, depending on where Sinai is, he's in that area, okay, which we're going to get into next week. Okay, there, as he is in Midian, he sits down by a well. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, where they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian." So keep that in mind. Moses was still an Egyptian at this point. Why would they say an Egyptian came to rescue us? Because he's not Egyptian, is he? He's Hebrew.
Unless he's still dressed like he was.
He looks like an Egyptian. He acts like an Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian. Okay? So.
Question as far as like the Pharaoh's daughter raised him, and but how did, at some point he figured out he was really a Hebrew.
Right.
So did the Pharaoh's daughter, of course we don't know probably, how did he find out he was really a Hebrew?
I think he knew all along because, his mother raised him. And let's say that he wasn't weaned until he was 4 or 5 years old. Yeah. He would have memories about all that. And his mother probably told him and talked to him and enforced that. And so, by being raised in Pharaoh's daughter, by Pharaoh's daughter, I can't really see that there was a whole lot of a love that was attached there, a whole lot of care. I mean, who knows? Maybe she did, but I just kind of thinking about, that family dynamic of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter, because, Pharaoh's got a lot of kids, a lot of wives. Who gets attention from dad? Who gets attention from mom? Because, you've got, servants that raise you and everything like that. And so, for Pharaoh's daughter, I can see her doing the same thing with Moses. Okay. But I don't know that. That's just my conjecture over it. So anyway, Marge, what made Moses think this or realize this? I don't know, but I just kind of think he knew it all along. Now I know that the common storyline of all of this is that Moses had an epiphany one day and came to realize it. And I bet he did kind of come to realize it one day of, hey, wait a minute, these are my people out there who are doing this. And then he wants to go and visit them and do something about it. But, I kind of think that he knew who he was all along. Okay? Okay. So anyway, long story short is that here are these 2 different daughters. Reuel is what it says here. This is also Jethro. Jethro is his name later on. But when they came back and they said, hey, you're home early. And they said, yeah, this Egyptian came and helped us out. And he's like, where is he? And why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat. And so Moses agrees to come home with them. And then Jethro or Reuel gives his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And so that keeps Moses there in that family for the next 40 years. Okay? All right. Comments and questions about any of that?
I was just thinking about, maybe how he knew, because other people knew she didn't give birth, and especially if you want more attention from Pharaoh, you're going to let him know you're just a Hebrew.
Right.
Because if they realize it or if they know it, that's what I was wondering. Maybe they figured it out and told them.
Yeah. So that's another reason why I just don't think it was kept from him as being a secret, but maybe it was. Maybe it was kept from other people too. But I don't know how you could keep that from being a secret. What's that?
Don't forget that he was supposed to be killed, and there's a pretty big reason for his identity being concealed, so he's not killed.
Yeah. What's that?
He was supposed to be killed,
Yeah.
Okay.
and if they knew his identity, they would have killed him.
Well, that is true. However, I think that it's kind of like, if he's with Pharaoh's daughter and she's raising him as a pet, that's okay too. Because the main concern is we're just trying to keep the Hebrew population down. And now we've got him over on our side. But that may be true too.
Yeah.
That's probably the origin of the people in the stories.
Yeah. The fact that she names him Moses because she draws him out, that to me, that's not really keeping it much of a secret. I drew him up out of the water. Hey, Dad, I got this kid. Where did this come from? Oh, I just drew him up out of the water. Okay. All right. Okay. Anybody else got anything? Okay. Well, we will continue on next week. Next week, we're going to be talking about how God continues to raise up this deliverer in the fact that now he's going to take Moses and put his plans into actions with Moses' life. So we're going to be taking a look at Exodus chapters 3, 4, and possibly going into 5, but definitely 3 and 4. Okay? Okay, well, let's bow our heads. Dear Lord in heaven, we thank you for everything you've given us. We thank you for your blessings, and we thank you for this time that we spent in your word. We ask that you please be with us, help us to understand it. Please help us to take it to heart and know that that you're on your throne and that your ways are the best, and we are just simply we're simply tools to be used by you. So please use us for your honor and your glory, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.